How's it going, everybody? And today I'm going to read some of Peter Sloterdijk's critique of cynical reason. A very, very influential book by Peter Sloterdijk. And over the next few weeks, I'm just going to be reading some sections out of this book. So feel free to read along. And if you have any questions or thoughts in the comments, please feel free to put them in there. Okay, we're going to start at the preface. Beat the drum and have no fear, and kiss the camp follower. This is the whole of science. That is the deepest of books' meaning. Heinrich Heine, Doctrine. The great defect of German thinkers is that they have no sense of irony, cynicism, the grotesque, contempt and mockery. Otto Flake, Deutsche, Französisch. For a century now, philosophy has been lying on its deathbed, but it cannot die because it has not fulfilled its task. Its farewell thus has been tortuously drawn out. Where it has not foundered in the mere administration of thoughts, it plods on in glittering agony, realizing what it forgot to say during its lifetime. Faced with its demise, it would like now to be honest and reveal its last secret. It confesses the great themes. They were evasions of half and half truths, those futile, beautiful, soaring flights: God, universe, theory, praxis, subject, object, body, spirit, meaning, nothingness. All that is nothing. They are nouns for young people, for outsiders, clerics, sociologists, words, nouns. They need only to open their wings and millennia fall out of their flight. Gottfried Benn, Epilogue, Lyrisch, Ich. The last philosophy, willing to confess, treats such things under a historical rubric, together with the sins of youth. Their time has come. In our thinking, there is no longer any spark of the uplifting flight of concepts, or of the ecstasies of understanding. We are enlightened. We are apathetic. No one talks any more of love of wisdom. There is no longer any knowledge whose friend, philos, one could be. It does not occur to us to love the kind of knowledge we have. Rather, we ask ourselves how we might contrive to live with it without becoming ossified. What is presented here under a title that alludes to the great traditions is a meditation on the sentence, knowledge is power. This is the sentence that dug the grave of philosophy in the 19th century. It sums up philosophy and is at the same time its first confession, with which the century-long agony begins. This sentence brings to an end the tradition of knowledge that, as its name indicates, was an erotic theory, the love of truth and the truth through love. From the corpse of philosophy arose the modern sciences and the theories of power in the 19th century, in the form of political science, theory and of class struggle, technocracy, vitalism, and in every form armed to the teeth. Knowledge is power. Wissen ist Macht. This sentence fixed the course for the unavoidable politicization of thinking. Those who utter the sentence reveal the truth. However, with the utterance, they want to achieve more than truth. They want to intervene in the game of power. At the same time as Nietzsche began to expose the will to power behind every will to know, the old German social democracy exhorted its members to participate in the race for knowledge, that is power. Where Nietzsche's insights were intended to be dangerously cold and without illusions, social democracy behaved pragmatically and exhibited a middle-class joy in cultivation. Both spoke of power. Nietzsche by undermining bourgeois idealism with vitalism, the Social Democrats by seeking to gain access to the middle class's opportunities for power through cultivation. Nietzsche thought a realism that was supposed to make it easy for the upcoming generations of bourgeois and petty bourgeois to take their farewell from idealistic absurdities. which curbed the will to power. Social democracy strove for participation in an idealism that to that point had carried the promise of power within itself. In Nietzsche, the middle class could study the subtleties and clever crassness of a will to power that had lost its ideals, while the workers' movement looked fugitively at an idealism that better suited its still naive will to power. Around 1900s, the radical left wing had caught up with the right-wing cynicism of the masters. The race between the cynical defensive consciousness of the old bearers of power and the utopian offensive consciousness of the new bearers created the political moral drama of the 20th century. In the race for the hardest awareness of the hard facts, the devil and the Beelzebub trained one another. Out of the competition of consciousness arose that twilight characteristic of the present, the mutual spying out of ideologies, the assimilation of antagonisms, the modernization of fraud, in short, the situation that forces the philosopher into the void where liars call liars liars. We detect a second aspect in Nietzsche that is relevant to contemporary times. After the first fascist Nietzsche wave has ebbed, once more it becomes clear how Western civilization has worn out its Christian costume. After the decades of reconstruction and the decade of utopias and alternatives, it is as if a naive elan had suddenly been lost. Catastrophes are conjured up. New values find ready markets like all analgesics and analgesics. However, the times are cynical and no, new values have short lives. Being concerned, caring about people, securing peace, feeling responsible, caring about the quality of life and about the environment, none of that really works. Just bide your time. Cynicism stands ready in the background until the palaver has stopped and things make their course. Our lethargic modernity certainly knows how to think historically, but it has long doubted that it lives in a meaningful history. No need for world history. The eternal reoccurrence of the same, Nietzsche's most subversive thought, cosmologically untenable, but culturally and morphologically fruitful, is an apt description of a resurgence of cynical, cynish-ish, and this is cynical that Sloterdijk is writing is with a K. Cynical motives that had developed to conscious life, especially during the time of the Roman emperors, but also to some extent in the Renaissance. The same, those are the wrappings of a sober, pleasure-oriented life that has learned to live with circumstances, to be ready for anything that makes one invulnerably clever. Live in spite of history, existential reduction, socialization, as if, irony about politics, mistrust toward plans. A new heathen culture that does not believe in life after death, and some must seek life before death. Nietzsche's decisive self-characterization, often overlooked, is that of a cynic with a C, cynicer. With this, he became, next to Marx, the most momentous thinker of the century. Nietzsche's cynicism with a C, cynismus, offers a modified approach to saying the truth. It is one of strategy and tactics, suspicion and disinhibition, pragmatics and instrumentalism. All this in the hands of a political ego that thinks first and foremost about itself, an ego that is inwardly adroit and outwardly armored. The violent anti-rationalistic impulse in Western countries is reacting to an intellectual state of affairs in which all thinking has become strategy. This impulse shows a disgust for a certain form of self-preservation. It is a sensitive shivering from the cold breath of a reality where knowledge is power and power is knowledge. In writing, I think I have thought of readers, have wished for readers who feel this way. This book, I think, could have something to say about them. The old social democracy had announced the slogan, "Knowledge is power," as a practical and reasonable prescription. It did not think too much about it. The message was simply that one has to learn something real so that life will be better later. A petty bourgeoisie belief in schooling had dictated the slogan. This belief is disintegrating today. Only for our cynical young medicos is there still a clear link between study and standard of living. Almost everyone else lives with the risk of learning without prospects. Those who do not seek power will also not want its knowledge armaments. And those who reject both are secretly no longer citizens of this civilization. Countless numbers of people are no longer prepared to believe that one first has to learn something so that things will be better. In these people, I believe, a suspicion is growing. That was a certainty in ancient cynicism, kynismus, that things must first be better before you can learn anything sensible. Socialization through schooling, as it takes place here and in Western societies in general, is a priori stupefaction, after which scarcely any learning offers a prospect that things sometimes or other will improve. The inversion of the relationship or the relation between life and learning is in the air, the end of the belief in education, the end of European scholasticism. That is what conservatives, as well as pragmatists, voyeurists of the decline, as well as well-meaning individuals alike find so eerie. Basically, no one believes anymore that today's learning solves tomorrow's problems. It is almost certain rather than that it causes them. Why a critique of cynical reason? How can I defend myself against the charge of having written a thick book at a time when even thinner books are considered more impudent? As is proper, we should distinguish the occasion from the reason and the motive. The occasion. The year is 1981, and it is the 200th anniversary of the publication of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. A date in world history. Seldom has there been a jubilee as dull as this one. It is a sober celebration. The scholars keep to themselves. 600 Kant experts gathered in minds. That does not produce a carnival atmosphere, at most endless paper streams. An imagination would be useful to picture what would happen if the celebrated figure were to appear among the contemporaries. Is it not a sad festival where the invited guests secretly hope that the person being celebrated is prevented from appearing because those who constantly invoke him would have to be ashamed upon his arrival? How would we look at the penetratingly human eye of the philosopher? Who could bring himself to give Kant a summary of history since 1795, the year in which the philosopher published his essay on perpetual peace? Who would have the nerve to inform him about the state of the Enlightenment, the emancipation of humanity from its self-imposed dependency? Who would be so frivolous to explain to him Marx's thesis on Feuerbach? I imagine that Kant's splendid humour would help us out of our stunned state. He was, after all, an individual of the 18th century, when even the irrationalists were not yet as rigid as some today who pretend to be so free and easy. Scarcely anyone has occupied himself with Kant without touching on the enigma of his physiology, applying the Roman rule of thumb, mens sans in corpore sano, does not help us grasp his appearance at all. If it is true that the spirit seeks the appropriate body, in Kant's case, it must have been a spirit who found pleasure in physiognomic ironies, and psychosomatic paradoxes, a spirit who hid a great soul in a small, gaunt body, an upright stride under a bent back, and a gregarious, delicately cordial humour in a hypochondriacal, compulsive temperament, as if to play a joke on the later devotees of the vital and the athletic. The physiognomic enigma of Kant is scarcely solved through his personality, but rather through his position in the history of ideas of sensuousness. The Age of Enlightenment pushed the dialectic of understanding and sensuousness to the breaking point. The traces of such tensions run through the whole of Kant's work. The language of his main works reveals the violence that the process of thinking, especially in the German mind, inflicts on the sensuous. The fact that a poet like Gottfried Benn, himself stamped by the spirit of the century of natural science, could strike back against such violence by rebuking the philosopher for being a violator of the intellect, shows how modern cynicism can become the sounding board for cogent insights against the erstwhile greatness of knowing. That aims at the notoriously broken relation between intellect and sensuousness. Robert Musil, surely a guarantor of rationality even beyond the limits in which it feels secure, has captured the experience of a reading of Kant in a memorable passage of his Confusions of the pupil Dorless. In fact, Torless, that very morning, had bought the Reclaim edition of that volume that he had seen at his professor's and used the first recess to begin reading it. However, because the profusion of brackets and footnotes, he didn't understand a single word. And when he conscientiously followed the sentences with his eyes, it was as if an old bony hand were slowly screwing his brain out of his head. When he stopped in exhaustion after about half an hour, he had only reached the second page, and sweat stood in his brow. But then he gritted his teeth and read again, one page further, until the recess was over. By evening, however, he did not even want to touch the book. Fear? Repulsion? He didn't quite know. Only one thing tortured him with burning clarity. That the professor, this person who didn't look like much, had the book lying around openly in his room, as if it were for him a daily conversation. The delicate empiricism of this sketch awakens understanding of two things: the fascination of the book and the pain it inflicts on sensitive young readers. Does not an ingenious contact with Kantian thinking, with philosophical thinking in general, contain the risk of exposing a young consciousness to a violent and sudden aging? What if a youthful will to know is preserved in a philosophy that makes one dizzy with its bony spiraling turns of the screw? Is what we want to know found at the top end of a screw? Are we ourselves not perhaps so twisted at the head of the screw that we will be satisfied with what we now think we know? And what does it mean that people from whom Kantian thinking is daily conversation don't look like much? Does it mean that philosophy no longer leaves any trace in life, and that reality in one thing and philosophy in something hopelessly different? From the style of philosophers, physiognomic forms look out at us, forms in which reason has hidden aspects of its essential character. To be reasonable means to put oneself into a special, rarely happy relation to the sensuous. Be reasonable means, practically speaking, do not trust your impulses, do not listen to your body, learn control, starting with your own sensuousness. But intellect and sensuousness are inseparable. Torles's outbreak of sweating after 2 pages of the Critique of Pure Reason contains as much truth as the whole of Kantianism. The understood mutual interaction of physis and logos in philosophy, not what is spoken. And the future only physiognomists can be a philosopher who does not lie. Physiognomic thinking offers a chance to escape from the regime of disembodiment and therefore evil minds. To announce a new critique of reason also means to have a philosophical physiognomy in mind. That is not, as with Adorno, aesthetic theory, but a theory of consciousness with flesh and blood and teeth. As things are, there are grounds not for a celebratory writing, but rather for a writing celebration that makes a long detour around the celebrated person out of a liking of the author. I don't want to say how things lie. I want to show you how the matter stands. So I've just read the preface of the critique of Cynical Reason by Peter Sloterdijk. And over the next few days, I will read The Occasion and the second part of the sort of fourth part of the preface. So basically, I've read the preface, I've read The Occasion tonight, and then I will read Reason and The Motive in the next few days. So thanks for listening, and hopefully you're reading along and you're finding it interesting. I think Peter Sloterdijk is really hitting on something very, very interesting here in the history of philosophy. The state of rationality at the moment, that it's devolving into a form of cynicism and knowledge is power. And when Sloterdijk talks about this being a meditation on knowledge and power, I mean, one can think immediately of Francis Bacon and more recently Foucault. So there's a lot to chew on here, and I hope you can read along, and it will be very interesting to see what Sloterdijk finds in this book, because that image of Torless sweating from a brow, I mean, I find that throughout my undergraduate anyway, I mean, I was reading Bertrand Russell, for example, and his theory of language. I mean, I had the same experience. But there's a truth exactly in what he said. There's a truth in the pain that you go through as a young philosopher to get into these texts. And does not an ingenious contact with Kantian thinking, with philosophical thinking in general, contain the risk of exposing a young consciousness to a violent and sudden aging? So food for thought. I'll see you later.